great to be back here at GW, and I want to thank President LeBlanc for welcoming all of us. Our family loves coming here, and we were just talking backstage that both my husband and Chelsea, as well as myself, have been here numerous times on this stage, Bill and I speaking, Chelsea dancing when she was in the Washington Ballet. So
I don't know why you all just laughed. I mean, I was never a star, to put it mildly, but I wasn't bad.
But it's just great being here, and always great to be with you, Lissa.
Well, thank you. I feel like we've done this now.
Yes.
We've done it in various combinations, and it's always fun, and it's such an honor for me. And first, I just want to thank you on behalf of womankind for this book. I was saying to them ahead of time that the frustration tonight is going to be that we can only talk about so many of them, not nearly the range that we would want to. Otherwise, we would, and we could, right? We could stay for a week and talk about all of them.
Yes.
It's an amazing book. It's so important to have the stories of so many women in one place. And we'll talk about that in a second. So we should get going because we don't have a ton of time and we want to cover as much ground as possible. But I want to start by saying, you wrote this book together. In journalism lingo, we would say you have a joint byline. So how did you decide whose name went first?
Gee, we didn't even really talk about that. No, age before beauty, obviously.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But the process of having a joint byline, of writing a book or anything with someone else, is incredibly rich because of the different experiences and points of view that your co-author brings to the project. And for Chelsea and me, it was especially exciting because this book comes out of a conversation we've had literally since she was a little girl, talking about people, especially women, who inspired us.
Yeah, no, and that's what's so great about it, is the stories are so deeply personal to each of you in some cases and to both of you in some cases, and across cultures and generations and geographies and backgrounds. And so, there's really, it's an extraordinary range that you've put together. Now, just one other kind of superficial question, sorry, but Chelsea, you have mentioned with a huge amount of affection and a tad of exasperation what it has been like to co-author a book with someone who still writes in longhand on yellow legal pads. Well, maybe not yellow, but anyway, on legal pads. So I'm just wondering if there were any other challenges working with your, archaic mother that you would care to share with, there are many students here, so I'm sure they would relate, that you want to share with us. Maybe not.
Well, thankfully, her penmanship is legible.
Yes, this is true.
So I did.
Unlike your father's.
Unlike my father's.
Yeah.
And Lissa, I knew that my mother wrote in longhand because I had seen her writing process for what happened most recently in her previous books. I hadn't, though, understood what that would be like for our working dynamic. And that not only does she kind of write longhand, she edits like pen on paper too. I thought surely she would have at least come to understand why track changes are our friend, or comment boxes. And yet she hadn't. And despite all of my efforts to persuade her that this would really help us work together and we could see our different thought processes and we could go back and forth in the document, I knew there was no way I was going to get her to do a shared Google Doc. I thought at least though track changes, she does know how to use a computer, but no, it just wasn't comfortable for her.
Okay, all right. Now really, in my defense, you know who else writes longhand for his books? Barack Obama. So I rest my case.
Okay. Well, he may be a dinosaur also. Okay, I'm gonna turn the tables a little bit so you're gonna get your chance. Because I'm sure there are many women in the room like me and you who have daughters whom we love deeply and transcendently. But mothers and daughters trying to write a book together conjures, at least I think for some people, images of a lot of screeching and door slamming. So were there any surprises for you working with your daughter?
And, you know, we started by making lists. And honestly, the lists were in the many hundreds of athletes we admired, entertainers we admired, business leaders, academics, public servants. I mean, we had many hundreds of names. And we began to try to narrow it down. And the only, you know, back and forth that we had in the beginning was I would advocate for the people I wanted to remain on the list. She would do the same. We would try to compromise. Sometimes I would say, no, I have to have her in. And Chelsea would say, no, I have to have her in. And so we ended up writing more than 200 essays. And our publisher rightly said...
Volume 2.
Yeah, well, our publisher rightly said, you know, that people have to carry, you know, the book around on a scooter or something because... So we cut dramatically, and that was hard. We had lots of really challenging conversations about who was going to be cut. Sometimes the editor would make suggestions, or I would, or Chelsea would, and then one of us would say, no, I don't want her cut. So that was the only real problem that we had, and we ended up with a very representative group of historic figures, fictional figures, contemporary figures that really did capture what we were trying to convey. Because at the end of the day, we are so grateful for these women and their lives, and we wanted them to be seen as whole people. They're not perfect. They're not, you know, up on a mountain somewhere. They worked hard. They overcame obstacles. They're gutsy because they made it clear that they were following their dream, that they had a mission in their lives. And it wasn't easy. And so we think that those stories are good ones for us to share because we find them so inspirational.
Can I just follow up on that a little bit? Because one of the things that is interesting is the sort of span that you cover. And you talk a little bit, each of you, about the differences growing up, the sorts of role models. You had very few. You had your mom, you had your sixth grade teacher, Mrs. King, I think that was her name. You had Amelia Earhart, you had Jo in Little Women and Nancy Drew. And Chelsea, you had more. You had a pediatrician who was a woman. You had a mayor of Little Rock when you were, and you had a few more, not huge numbers, but at least a few more women figures who were brought up in your classes in school. But I wonder how that sort of generational difference, how each of your experiences as women experiencing changing gender roles influenced these selections. Chelsea?
You know, I don't think I had quite understood the juxtaposition between kind of my mom's growing up and my growing up with regards to kind of women role models until we really started this effort. And my mom just reflected how the only women she knew who worked outside the home were her school teachers and the public librarians. Mm-hmm. And that was just so different than my growing up. The vast majority of my friends' moms worked outside the homes. Some who were lawyers like my mom, some who were nurses, doctors, entrepreneurs. As you mentioned, like when I was in kind of first grade, our mayor was Lottie Shackelford, a woman. Betty Lowe was my incredible pediatrician who took great care of me and kind of later went on to lead the Children's Hospital. And so I just had all of these really visible, kind of dynamic and inspiring women who were in my life. And I also thankfully had teachers really all throughout school who were determined that not only history, but also social studies and science and math were not seen as just the province of like old, straight, white men. Mm-hmm. And so I'm so thankful to my teachers who kind of, introduced me to kind of, Grace Hopper or Elizabeth Peratrovich, these kind of amazing women who then I write about kind of in Gutsy Women, and I may never have known about them but for my teachers. So I just had such a different experience.
It's so interesting that you really weren't that aware till this process of that. Does that surprise you at all?
When we began talking about it, we both realized what a gap there was. Mm-hmm. Because, in my case, there were women that I read about in books or in the pages of Life magazine. I include several of them because as a child, you know, Life magazine was one of the doorways to the world. So that's where I read about Amelia Earhart, or I read about Margaret Burke White, or you know, the amazing Margaret Chase Smith, the Republican senator from Maine who stood up against her own party and took on Joe McCarthy, and wouldn't we like to see that again? And so part of
That was one of my later questions.
that's how I met these women. There wasn't very much in my elementary and junior high school years, probably, as I recall, not even much in high school years, that talked about women. I mean, maybe, you know, you study ancient Egypt, Cleopatra might be mentioned, but Hatshepsut would not be mentioned. And so part of it was just coming to grips with how hungry I was and how encouraging my own mother was for me to pursue these women and learn more about them. But it wasn't part of my schooling at that point in history. In fact, there's a funny story in the book because I came across Helen Keller because of a television dramatization of her life, and this amazing woman who was taught by Anne Sullivan to communicate. Fast forward, last year the Texas State Board of Education decided to eliminate Helen Keller and me from the curriculum, and I was really upset about Helen Keller being eliminated. Thankfully, you know, cooler heads prevailed, and apparently we're both in, although I hope she has a lot more prominence than that, because she deserved it. So, and then I talk about how I go to the library, the public library. I went every week with my mom, or when I got old enough, rode my bike. And the librarian, you know, that was taking care of kids, you know, she said, "You've got to read this new book. It's about this young girl named Anne Frank." I mean, I didn't know anything about the Holocaust or about what happened. I was probably, I don't know, 10 years old. So that was how I discovered these women. And as Chelsea and I were talking about it, it was a very different experience between the two of us.